It is wonderful to be with this great group again this year. It's particularly wonderful to be looked on as the host, having done absolutely nothing at all except to respond to a couple of emails from Ed Hockin and from Frank. I do want to start off by noting, of course, that we do have the great man himself looking down on us this evening. So any of you who talk, especially when Ron Chernow is speaking, might be shot down by a thunderbolt, or perhaps one of the drones that I took with me when I left my last government position. I do want to thank Reverend Nizola for a very, very timely, very eloquent, and very meaningful blessing. Let us have peace indeed, and we thank you for that. And Deborah, I thought for a moment there that we were actually across the park in Lincoln Center when we heard your wonderful rendition of America the Beautiful. Thank you. And to Frank and to the members of the board and the supporters of the Grant Monument Association, let me just compliment you once again this year on the steady, incremental achievements, and that's how you make progress in these kinds of endeavors, to the condition of the Grant Monument. As you know, the condition of that monument was almost a metaphor for America's regard for General Grant, and it was quite run down in the 60s, 70s, 80s, graffiti-covered, trash-strewn, in disrepair. And as the regard for General Grant has returned to what it should have been and what it was in the early decades after his death, so too has the condition of the monument. And it is great to see it continue, and delighted to hear the news about the New York Park Service. Now, Frank, you noted what a thrill it is to have with us tonight one of America's greatest, if not the greatest, biographer of his generation. Someone who has continued what now is really a tradition of American biographers getting it great. And so not only has the condition of the Grant Monument Association been improved dramatically, so has the reputation of a man who deserved much better than he received, particularly from the Southern historians in the early part of the last century, and from what they did to elevate Robert E. Lee, who you almost felt, does anybody realize that he actually lost and Grant won? And I will note, you can anticipate a question about a comparison of Robert E. Lee and the job he did relative to that of the man we celebrate tonight. But Ron, it's a privilege to do this with you again. We did it at the 92nd Street Y. My wife remarked to me later on after that event that I had a smile on my face the whole night, and I did. And I think you'll see why, because Ron is a brilliant storyteller, and you will certainly, I think, agree with that after tonight. I want to start off certainly in congratulating you on another extraordinary book, one that is vast, that is exhaustively researched, it's panoramic, but most of all, it's exceptionally readable, very lively, and most enjoyable, and it's already emerging as the classic work on Ulysses S. Grant. I emphasize, by the way, readable, lively, and enjoyable, as some might be intimidated by its size. Don't be. Again, he is an extraordinary storyteller. Ron has, of course, authored exceptional books on John D. Rockefeller, Alexander Hamilton, the Warburgs, the House of Morgan, and George Washington, which, as Frank noted, the latter of which won a Pulitzer. And, of course, the book on Hamilton was the inspiration for the extraordinarily successful rap play. So let me start, if I could, Ron, just by asking how you happened to pick Grant to write his biography.
Right. First, let me say, General, what an honor and a pleasure and a privilege it is to be interviewed by you. As you mentioned, this is the second time we've done this, and I feel more than a little humble being interviewed by General Petraeus. I feel like I should be the one interviewing you. So I was like, what is wrong with this picture?
If
So
I had
anyway,
a Pulitzer, I guarantee you would be. But
Thank you for that very gracious introduction. You know, I had done, I'd spent 11 years doing biographies of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. I thought the time had come to give the founding fathers a breather from me. I think they were all probably very relieved by that. And you know, what I've tried to do with biography, I've tried to use biography as a prism through which to examine not only a life, but a period. And so what had attracted me to both Hamilton and Washington was simply following their lives. The Revolutionary War, the Constitutional Convention, the forging of the federal government, all of these formative moments in American history flicker by like in some fabulous newsreel. And I wanted to do something similar for the Civil War and Reconstruction, a kind of big sweeping dramatic epic. And the figure who is central to both the Civil War and Reconstruction, really the figure who unites those two eras, is Grant. Had Lincoln lived, Lincoln would have been the person. So that was kind of a major part of it. I felt that Grant, you know, would be the perfect springboard for doing what I wanted to do. I also seem to have a contrarian streak in my nature, and so I'm always looking for subjects whom I feel have been perhaps underrated or misunderstood or caricatured in some way, and that's when I find myself plunging in. And I think there have been few figures in American history who have been as badly and unfairly stereotyped as Ulysses S. Grant.
well, we're very grateful to you for doing that. You know, it's true that America really had no opinion of Hamilton, I think, as the, I mean, he
Well, it
was,
was funny because when I started doing the Hamilton book in 1998, one of the reasons that I chose Hamilton, he seemed to be fading into obscurity. It
Yeah.
seems comical now. He's the darling of Broadway. His name is up in lights, you know, on the marquee of the Richard Rodgers Theater. But at the time, almost Americans knew about Alexander Hamilton. Maybe they knew he was on the $10 bill. Maybe if they were real history buffs, they knew he had died in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr, but that was it. And I don't know that Grant had faded quite that much into the woodwork as Hamilton did. But it's very interesting. We were talking at dinner, you know, not just my book, there have been biographies by Ron White and H.W. Brands and Gene Edward Smith. There's been kind of a whole slew of biographies about Grant over the last 10 or 15 years. And all of us are coming out with much, much more favorable impressions of him before, which kind of raises the question, to go back to the Southern historians.
Sure.
Why has it taken, you know, 150 years for this
why
man
has it
to
taken
get
150 years for this man to get his due?
Well, you know what happened? After the Civil War, a school of historians sprang up in the South called the Lost Cause School, and they tried to retrospectively justify the war and essentially tell the story of the Civil War and then Reconstruction from the Southern point of view. And they argued that slavery had been a great success. The slaves were really very happy. The only reason the slaves were unhappy was because there had been these abolitionist agitators from the North had stirred them up. They argued that the cause of the war was not slavery, but states' rights. And as part of this attempt really to vindicate the Confederacy, they puffed up Robert E. Lee to godlike proportions. And I mean godlike for those of you who've been in Southern churches. To this day, it still is not unusual to go into a Southern church and see in the stained glass window, you know, there will be Robert E. Lee, you know, or Stonewall Jackson, where one would expect to see, you know, God or a saint, you know, there's Lee. And part of this whole process of puffing Lee up to godlike proportions was unfortunately denigrating Grant.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the image of Grant as this brutal, you know, butcher of a general, that Lee was really not only a noble gentleman, but he was a general with sort of great, you know, finesse and skill, and that Grant won simply by dint of overwhelming numbers. And they would point out that the North had superior manpower. The North had a population, I think, about 4 times as large. Northern manufacturing was much larger. But what becomes very clear when you start examining this is that if you just look at the Civil War in Virginia with the Army of the Potomac, there had been Irving McDowell, and then there had been George McClellan and Ambrose Burnside, and Joseph Hooker, George Gordon Meade, et cetera, et cetera. There had been a whole parade of previous generals.
McClellan twice.
McClellan twice, that's right. Thank you.
And then gets to run for president, too.
Right,
I mean,
but we'll get
after
to
failing
that. Yeah, we'll
twice.
get to that. But Grant had all these predecessors before he came east to Virginia in March 1864, who had exactly the same advantages, northern manpower and material, and they had all lost to Lee. So clearly something was going on other than those, as it were, natural advantages that the North had. And Grant was at pains both then and then later on in his memoirs to say that the image of northern superiority, that all the advantages were on the north and the south, was really very, very misleading. He pointed out that the Union Army was always operating in enemy territory, which meant not only a hostile population, but a population that was acting as spies, providing intelligence. He pointed out, of course, the Southerners intimately knew the geography, and in so many of these battles, it all revolves around geography. Grant pointed out that the South had the advantage, Lee had the advantage of always fighting on the defensive, or almost always fighting on the defensive. And under military doctrine at the time, it was thought that you needed to have at least 2 or 3 times the number of soldiers because of the natural advantages. There's also a very interesting school of thought that if you look at the Civil War, there were much greater advances being made at that time on defense rather than offense. And in fact, the sort of fortifications that Lee and the Southerners were building, which really kind of looked forward to World War I, were very, very sophisticated, kind of more sophisticated in many ways than the offense that was coming against them.
Well, and if you think about what Lee should have done, of course he blew it. I mean, his strategy should have been keep the North roiled with draft riots and unrest and just convince them that they can't win. And then get Lincoln defeated in the election of 1864. And by the way, McClellan had stated, the opponent of Lincoln, had stated that he would sue for peace if he was elected. And that was the only way the South could, quote, win. And yet he gambled it all with the Gettysburg expedition and a bunch of other offensive operations that cost him very dearly.
And Grant felt that Lee had made major strategic miscalculations. Lee had a very, very strong sentimental attachment to his home state of Virginia, as we all know. And Grant felt that Lee, to his detriment, had hunkered down in Richmond and Petersburg when the smart thing would have been to have broken away. And so essentially, and it's kind of very interesting because, during the so-called, the Overland Campaign, the Wilderness Campaign, Lee actually says to his officers that just at moments it looks like things are not going well for Grant, and Lee says to them, if this continues, it'll be a siege, and it'll be all over because he's steadily being pushed back to the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg. And so he saw that coming, and I think that Grant felt that it was his personal and political attachment to defending Richmond and Petersburg that actually undermined his critical judgment in terms of what he should have done.
Well, there was a wonderful story in the Washington Post that sort of captured all this, which was titled, "The Truth About General Robert E. Lee. He Wasn't Very Good at His Job." So much for and by the way, there were even movies about the Lost Cause. If you think about it, the most memorable movie of the Civil War is, of course, Gone with the Wind. And what does it depict the Confederacy as? But, and again, this glorious, elegant, and gentlemanly affair. So that brings me to ask, with Hamilton in mind, when does the rap play or the movie that will solidify Grant's reputation beyond a shadow of a doubt emerge?
Well, I realized very, very early on in the research on Grant that his life did not move to a hip-hop beat. Hamilton was kind of perfect. Hamilton was sort of dazzling and flamboyant. Hamilton was perfect for a musical. I realized that I couldn't imagine all these kind of, good-looking young men and women dancing around the stage about Ulysses S. Grant. But it is going to be a movie. The rights to the book were bought by Lionsgate, which is a
Fantastic.
wonderful
Yeah.
studio, and also Appian Way, which is a production company for Leonardo DiCaprio. So DiCaprio is going to produce it. And I was telling the general over dinner, when I was out in LA last year, I was saying to the producers, I said, it's really time to have a major Civil War movie that replaces Gone with the Wind, that really presents the northern point of view. You would never know that they lost the war. It's time to acknowledge that, and also, of course, time to do justice to Grant.
Well, let's, especially with the cadets in the room here.
Yeah. It's so wonderful to have the cadets.
It is
and the
wonderful to see
midshipmen
the cadets here. And by the way, Frank, it's been decided by at least two members of the board, Ed and me, that we're going to add one of the colonels from West Point to the board, which I think is entirely fitting, especially as it's finally going to have a monument to Grant after all of the roads, entries, halls, and everything else named for Robert E. Lee. So at one point in time, you were mentioning at the table, while he was at West Point, where he was not a particularly distinguished or assiduous student,
Right.
that Congress had a debate, one of these periodic debates that we've had many times since, about whether or not to close West Point. And what was his view on this particular matter?
Grant was rooting for the abolition of West Point. He said he avidly followed this debate in the newspapers. He was hoping that Congress would make good on this threat to close West Point. What happened? Grant went to West Point. He was a disaster. He was kind of lackluster. He graduated 21 out of class of 39, I think. He was strangely, for someone who became such a great, really world historical figure, he was strangely unambitious. His father didn't suggest that he go to West Point. His father told him he was going. His father announced that he was going to West Point. And Grant really, most great figures in history, like Hamilton, the earliest letter that we have from Alexander Hamilton, when he was 14 years old, he wrote a letter to his closest friend, and the last line was, "I wish there was a war," because he wanted a war to come so he could win military glory. There's sort of nothing like that in Grant's early years. In fact, I was amused in one of his letters when he graduates from West Point. He's saying that his dream is to become an assistant math professor at the academy. Not a full math professor, mind you, an assistant math professor. I mean, it's hard to believe. The whole story is just incredible because the war breaks out. He's working in this leather goods store in Gillian, Illinois. He's working as a clerk junior to his two younger brothers. And
Having
then
failed at
having
everything,
failed at
he'd done
everything.
since really he was in the Mexican War.
Yeah,
where he
in
was
the
quite
Mexican War,
good.
with
And
distinction.
we'll come back to why he also had to leave the Army.
But the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, and 2 months later he's a colonel, and then 4 months later he's a brigadier general, and 10 months later he's a major general. And then by the end of the war, he's general-in-chief. He has 1 million soldiers under his command. I mean, it kind of gives new meaning to a meteoric rise. And then he becomes a two-term president. But I think it is significant that he did fight with tremendous distinction in the Mexican War.
Yes.
Now, in the Mexican War,
As a
Grant,
logistician.
yeah, well, this is kind of
Yeah.
this is sort of very significant. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about writing history, because you can sort of look back and you identify these things that might have seemed trivial at the time. But he fought for 4 years in Mexico, and he was a quartermaster, and also did commissary duty. Now, as quartermaster, he was not obligated to actually fight in a single battle. He volunteered and fought in every single battle that his unit was involved in. But his work as a quartermaster turns out to be extremely important, because what's going to happen in the Civil War is that he has a mastery of logistics second to none. And what's going to distinguish his period as general-in-chief is that he is simultaneously supervising 4 distinct armies across a 1,500-mile front. And so here is someone who not only has a very good sense of tactics and strategy, but here's someone who has kind of a nuts and bolts understanding of the administration of an army. And Grant uses the telegraph, he uses the railroad. He's really kind of quite the maestro, simply in terms of feeding and housing and moving and motivating the men, apart from tactics and strategy. His record was outstanding. Needless to say, he could never have foreseen that, because quartermaster sounds, it maybe seemed to him, rather lowly at the time and not glorious in the Mexican War. And yet fate is grooming him for this much, much bigger conflict to come years
And
down.
he actually was breveted twice, wasn't
That's
he?
right,
Actually,
yeah.
He was mentioned in dispatches for his
and
heroism.
And this was kind of volunteering
yeah.
for different
and some
things.
quite heroic. What he
Oh
did
yeah,
in the
one
tower.
where that's right. He goes up to this belfry and he brings a howitzer up there and
Yeah.
takes this guy. Another one, he was a real daredevil as a horseman, and he has to carry a message, and this in a town where every time the horse went by an intersection, he would be a moving target. And so what he does is he slings his arm over the saddle, and he rides alongside the horse, kind of using, if you could picture this, the horse as a shield as he's riding. It was just an incredible thing. So there were these moments that kind of preview that there was something exceptional about this guy.
But then, of course, his career sort of implodes.
Yeah, he serves on a series of remote bases in upstate New York, Detroit, Oregon, Northern California. He has a drinking problem, leaves the Army in 1854, fails at one job after another. His wife, Julia Dent, he married, this is kind of one of the great ironies of the story, he marries into the Dent family of St. Louis, and Colonel Frederick Dent, his future father-in-law, owns 30 slaves. Well, when Grant leaves the Army, Julia had gotten 60 acres as a wedding gift from her father, and Grant starts to farm it. And he was a very hard-working man, but he could not make a go of it. In desperation, he's finally forced to sell firewood on street corners in St. Louis. Saddest of tale of all, one Christmas, he's forced to pawn his watch in order to buy presents for his family. Then finally, he gives up farming in despair. He works for his last year in St. Louis in a little two-person real estate outfit. He fails at that as well. He doesn't, his job in the real estate firm was to collect payments and collect debts. And Grant Grant was too much of a soft mark. Apparently he would go to, collect money from people and would end up whiling away the afternoon conversation with them. He was much too sympathetic to the debtors of the firm. And it's at that point, and he had this very, very overbearing and difficult father. And so Grant is in his late 30s. He goes to his father and he has to beg him for a job in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. And Grant, by this point, is a married man with 4 children, almost 40 years old. And it looks like this is going to be a completely forgettable, obscure life. And then there comes that moment, and this is always so exciting when you're a biographer, there comes that moment where the man or woman meshes with the historical moment. And I don't know that anyone has sort of meshed with the historical moment quite as explosively as Ulysses S. Grant does. And then he is just soaring. But the interesting thing is, I'd be curious to get your, because you've seen so much real combat. I just know these things from books. It amazed me, researching the story, that when the war comes, given the fact that he's failed at so many things, you'd think that he would be nervous and insecure and lacking confidence, and he's never really had all these soldiers under his command. But he doesn't seem to have that doubt.
No, it's one of the qualities that's truly extraordinary. And one, I think most of us are filled with a fair amount of self-doubt.
Yeah.
I remember during the surge, at really tough moments, again, keep in mind, we had 6 months to produce progress, or we could have been defunded on Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
And every now and then, I'd get together with the operational 3-star commander, the multinational Corps ROC commander, General Chernow, who actually replaced me a year and a half later. And I'd say, what do you think? When's this thing going to turn? You know, we'd look at our watches and we got 3 months to go here. We got to have some demonstrable results. What can we do to accelerate this? And he had this inner strength that was truly extraordinary. And I should note that when I really became reacquainted with and just smitten with Grant was during the surge, reading a book by Bruce Catton called Grant Takes Command. And it's about Grant and actually as a soldier. And there are these moments and episodes in there that were truly inspirational. We can leap ahead quickly to the bloody Battle of Shiloh, which of course is his worst tactical battle actually. Where he's surprised, he and Sherman, they're almost pushed back into the Tennessee River, and Grant is sitting in a chair that night. It's raining. He can't be inside because any available shelter is being used as a makeshift hospital. He can hear the cries of soldiers as their limbs are hacked off. He can hear the cries of the wounded still on the battlefield waiting to be recovered. And out of the dark comes Sherman. And again, Grant is there with his slouch hat. The rain is dripping slowly off it. He's got a stub of a cigar in his mouth. And Sherman comes up to him and says, well, Grant, we had the devil's own day today, didn't we? And Grant says, yep, lick 'em tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And I told that actually, after reading this during the surge in the early days. Mm-hmm. And we had some lick 'em tomorrow moments, and there are people in here that experienced some of those and know how grindingly, brutally difficult it was. Yeah. Frankly, Grant experienced vastly more of that. I mean, the butcher's bill in these battles was staggering. The lot in life of someone wounded or losing a limb in that era was very, very bad. And yet he had this indomitable will. It wasn't that he didn't grieve for his soldiers. It wasn't that he didn't care. He very much did. But this sheer inner strength was just massively impressive.
Yeah, and you know, Shiloh was so bloody, and that night was so bloody because there were kind of, you know, already thousands of corpses lying on the ground. It was a drenching rain. Apparently wild pigs were rooting around among all these corpses. There were also, you know, thousands of sort of wounded men, you know, groaning and writhing, you know, in the mud. It was a nightmarish night. Everyone who was there, you know, was haunted by it for the rest of their lives. And I can't think of another, you know, general at that point in the Civil War who would have dared to take the offensive again the next.
Which he did the next day.
Which he did.
And he did lick him tomorrow.
Yeah, and actually, you know, it's nice we have Sherman here, we have Grant there. Sherman made some fascinating observations on Grant, which are quite germane, I think, to this moment. Because he was always asked, well, what was so special about Grant? And one of the things he said was, he talked about Grant's optimism. And he said that Grant had faith in the outcome of battle. He said he could liken Grant's optimism to nothing so much as the faith that a Christian has in his Savior. You know, that Grant always felt that he was going to win. Sherman also made the very interesting statement. He said that Grant could always divine, that is, guess the moment when the side that then seized the initiative would go on to battle. Because you have to remember, these were very large-scale battles. Shiloh, there were 24,000 casualties. To put that in perspective, this is a 48-hour period. 24,000 casualties in 2 days. It's more than all the casualties of the Revolutionary War, the Mexican War, and the War of 1812 combined in this one battle. There was that much bloodshed. But Grant has the fortitude to divine that moment when to take the offensive, because a lot of these Civil War battlefields, they were kind of these seesaw moments. It seemed to have, he was very intuitive.
Well, he had this. I mean, he had judgment. And, you know, when people ask me, what did you look for in, say, the 3-star Corps commander when I was privileged to be a 4-star? And I think they thought, oh, Petraeus is always into fitness. He wants a
Yeah.
guy who can do a lot of push-ups, or he wants somebody who's tall and handsome, right?
Yeah.
I didn't care what they looked like or whether they could run
Yeah.
around the block. We wanted was someone with operational judgment who could get the big ideas right at his level within the context of the big ideas that I was trying to sketch out at mine. And he got that. I mean,
Yeah,
he had this incredible
Yeah.
ability. You've heard me argue, and I challenge anyone in this room, would-be historian, if you can come up with someone else. But Grant is the only general in U.S. Army history, in my view, who was brilliant in combat as a tactical commander, so that means he's a division commander roughly, and that was, of course, the Land Between the Lakes battles, where he really comes to some note. Then at Vicksburg, where he's operational, so now at the operational level, multiple divisions, an extraordinary battle that we'll come back to in a moment. And then at the strategic level, when he's commanding it all as the commander, the general-in-chief, and sketches out the first strategy that the Union really had with this brilliant lay. Sherman, you come like this and like that. Tidewater guys, you come out here. Sheridan, ultimately you're going down the valley, and Meade, you go where Lee goes.
Yeah.
And he sits in Lee and Meade's back pocket as he does this.
Yeah.
And by the way, think of any other general who's done that. Now, first of all, very few generals actually even get the opportunity to command at the tactical, operational, and strategic level, because wars generally have been that long. But really an exceptional figure, and again, much underappreciated.
Yeah, and for me, it was very interesting doing this book, following George Washington, because George Washington, in my mind, kind of great figure, second to none, but not as great a general as Grant by a long shot.
He was lousy tactically. He got pushed off in Manhattan and Long Island and New Jersey.
He lost more battles than he won. But, Washington would always come up with a very intricate plan of battle, and then it's almost a cliche, these plans would fall apart instantly. And Washington was then unable to improvise. Also, Washington very often during the Revolutionary War would call a council of war, and he liked that debate.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Grant almost never called a council of war. He was much more intuitive. He was much more self-reliant. And then he would come up with an intricate battle plan, but the difference was that when it fell apart, Grant was able to improvise in the heat of battle, and there are kind of many descriptions of him as suddenly, the tide of battle changed, dashing up 20, 30, 40 rapid-fire orders, kind of letter perfect. And he seemed to come alive in battle because in peacetime situations, he could be somewhat slow and shambling. He was sort of wired differently from the rest of us. In battle, it was like his pulse would quicken, his mind would sharpen, and his brain became very, very rapid. But Grant was constantly able to make adaptations throughout a battle in a way that George Washington was never able to do that.
Washington, of course, a brilliant, in a sense, political military figure, and that was his genius, as Eisenhower's was to be a coalition commander.
Yeah.
So don't let me run those down needlessly, but Grant was unique in my view. By the way, mentioning Sherman reminds me also of his saying that Sherman said, "I stood by Grant while he was drunk, and he stood by me while I was crazy."
Yeah.
I mean, we have to talk about, and one of the contributions that Ron's book makes, among a number, is very forthright and direct treatment of the issue of drinking.
Of drinking, yeah, because what I found about almost all the previous books on Grant had kind of veered off to one of two extremes, either sort of saying, oh, it was all overblown and these were just malicious enemies saying this, and then on the other hand, he was, a hopeless drunkard who somehow stumbled through the Civil War in this alcoholic haze. And I found that the problem was the question was always posed, was Grant a drunkard? And that's a very, very loaded term. It's a very kind of moralistic term. It implies that what we would now call alcoholism, a term not in existence then, but we call alcoholism was a moral failing, rather than really an inherited genetic disorder. And so Grant was an alcoholic. This was a problem that dominated many, many years of his life. But what I discovered was that this was something that he struggled with. I mean, even when he was in his 20s, he joined a temperance lodge when he was posted to upstate New York. So this was very, a pastor told him that he could not take even a single drink. I mean, he had many conversations about this. And then kind of most extraordinary at all, and it's a central relationship in the book, when he became Brigadier General, 4 months into the war, he hired a young lawyer from Galena named John Rawlins as effectively his chief of staff. And Rawlins, who was the son of an alcoholic and who knew about Grant's history, told Grant that he would sign on one condition, that Grant not touch a drop of liquor during the war, or he, Rawlins, would quit. Well, I wish I could sit here and tell you that Grant never touched a drop of liquor during the war. But what happened is fascinating, because when Grant did have lapses, Rawlins would call him on it, but Rawlins also came to believe that the fate of the Union rested on the shoulders of Ulysses S. Grant. So he's kind of privately chastising Grant at the same time that he's sort of publicly defending Grant from the drinking charges. I also was able to figure out why, because there were a lot of people who said, you know, I worked closely with Grant throughout the war, I never saw him drink. He had a very distinct pattern. He was a binge drinker. He would go 2 or 3 months without touching a drop of liquor. He had enough control over the problem. He never drank before battle, certainly never drank during a battle. But then it was almost he would allow himself in the aftermath of a battle, if he was going to another city where his soldiers and officers would not see him. He never wanted to sacrifice that respect, in which he was held. But I am happy to, report that over time he really did conquer the problem. And so, by the end of the Civil War, Grant is the guy at the banquet who's always turning his wine glass upside down, and there were very, very few reports during his 2 terms as president of Grant ever touching a drop of liquor. And I say in the war it was kind of a battle as hard as any he ever fought to get that under control, but he really did.
Yeah.
And deserves credit.
One other topic that you touched on, again quite directly, were charges of anti-Semitism that came from the episode when he was out in the West.
Yeah, okay, so this was December 1862. Picture the situation. Grant's army has penetrated deep into the Cotton Kingdom. They're in plantation country in Mississippi. There was an illicit traffic in smuggled cotton going on, which Grant was trying to stop. There were Jewish traders involved. There were probably many more Gentile traders involved, but Grant issues an order, an infamous anti-Semitic order, General Orders Number 11, banishing not just Jewish traders, but Jews, period, from the military department under his command. This order goes to Washington. Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton immediately countermand it. Grant said that he immediately repented of this. Okay, that's the piece of the story that a lot of people know. What a lot of people don't know is that Grant spent the rest of his life atoning for that wartime action. And he did more for the Jewish community than all the 19th century presidents combined. He became the first president to, for instance, speak out about human rights abuses abroad against Jews in Romania and in Russia. He actually appointed a Jewish general counsel to Romania, whose job was, who was protecting Jews who were being persecuted at the time. He appointed many, many Jews. And actually the most touching story, which really makes the point, is towards the end of his second term as president, there was a tiny synagogue in Washington, D.C., Adas Israel. And they were consecrating a new synagogue, so they invited Grant. Now here's the President of the United States, talking about a tiny synagogue that maybe had 40, 50 people. Grant not only goes, attends, he brings the President pro tem of the Senate, he brings one of his sons, and this was a long ceremony. The ceremony was in Hebrew, so Grant is sitting there in a hat and a shawl, and the elders of the congregation went up to him after an hour, and they said, Mr. President, we're so thrilled that you've come. You've stayed an hour. We know how busy you are. Please don't feel under any obligation to stay longer. Grant insisted on staying for the entire 3 hours with this tiny synagogue, and then at the end reached into his pocket and gave a personal donation to the congregation. So he did really absolutely everything in his power to live this down. And you know, General, I found, and this is, I spent 6 years every day with this man, this was not a man who was filled with hate. There was not a single racist word in any of his letters. I wish I could say that, you know, of General Sherman, where there most certainly were. You know, Grant, he was not a bigoted person. So the General Orders number 11, which was a terrible thing that he did, it really was out of character for him. And thank God he really spent the rest of his life atoning for it.
Yeah. Let's fast forward a bit then to the presidency. He holds the country together, really, under the disastrous presidency of Andrew Johnson. First president to be impeached, barely survives. Is stripped of his power to fire Grant, as I recall, so that they saw him as a bulwark. So how does he come to run for the presidency?
Yeah, you know, I think what happened, you all know the story. Andrew Johnson was impeached, but he was acquitted by one vote. And I think this is kind of interesting because we're going through, you know, kind of hyper-partisan moment in American politics right now. That what sometimes happens historically when you get these very kind of, you know, vicious partisan moments is that there suddenly is a figure who seems to rise above the fray, so that as the impeachment trial is going on, this is 1868, which means it's a presidential election year. And everyone since the war had been speculating. There had been speculation about Grant as president going back even to 1864. It was a little bit like Ike after the war. Here's a war hero, kind of certified hero. No one was quite sure what his political views were. No one was quite sure. In fact, the Republicans are sending all of these, you know, emissaries to try to find out, is Grant really one of us? It turned out he was a Republican, but no one was quite certain. But Grant is sort of levitating above all of this partisan warfare. And he always, even during the presidency, when of course he became very engulfed in partisan warfare, there's always a way in which he is still the Grant of the Civil War. He still is the Grant of Appomattox.
Yes.
That he has kind of like a symbolic place. And you see it in Grant's tomb. This is, Frank was saying, the largest mausoleum in Western Hemisphere. It showed that he had a symbolic place in the American imagination that I think was really in the 19th century, second only to Lincoln. And so I think that at that moment of malicious partisan infighting, he becomes a very attractive figure. No one's quite sure what his politics are. You know, he wants to let us have peace. But of course, the divisions in the country, boy, if you think the divisions in the country are deep at the moment, nothing compared to what the divisions were like, you know, during the Civil War and
reunited country.
You know, where there was just so much, this was issuing in terrible, terrible violence.
Yes.
You know.
And he held Reconstruction together for quite a period. Truly, I think, a heroic figure.
Yeah, he did. I mean, you know, one of the reasons.
Regard.
Yeah, I mean, one of the
People
reasons.
forget that Sherman dissolved entire state houses.
Yeah. Sheridan. Sheridan, yeah.
Sheridan.
Oh, yeah,
yes,
in New Orleans. In New Orleans.
Yes.
Yeah, and actually Sherman was very unsympathetic to Reconstruction. You know, he and Grant, who were so close, both personally and militarily during the war, they're politically very different.
Yes.
Sherman was much more conservative. Sherman was much more critical of Reconstruction. But one of the main reasons that I wanted to write this book, to go back to your first question, was that Grant's presidency has, you know, continues to be caricatured as a failed presidency that was marked by scandals and nepotism. And those things happen. But what I say in the book was that I think that these were minor flaws, but that there were major achievements, and there was no achievement that was greater than what Grant did to protect the 4 million former slaves in the South, who are now, slavery was abolished in the 13th Amendment. Those 4 million citizens have received equal rights under the law under the 14th Amendment, and then at least black males the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. By the time Grant becomes president, a situation has developed in the South where much of the white South is not prepared to share any power with the black community. And remember, there were states in the South, South Carolina and Mississippi, where the majority of the population was black. Overall, the black population in the South was 36%. So if blacks are really going to exercise the right to vote, exercise their political power, they were really going to be a major political force. Much of the white South was not prepared to do this. And starting in 1866 in a place called Pulaski, Tennessee, a Confederate Veterans Club called the Ku Klux Klan started. Then they started to, drill and march and wear uniforms. And then the Klan spread to every county in the South. So by the time that Grant became president, there were literally thousands of black citizens who were murdered without a single prosecution. This was the largest outbreak of mass terrorism in our history. There was no Southern sheriff who would dare to arrest a member of the Klan, no Southern jury that would convict a member of the Klan. There was no Southern white who would testify against the Klan. Grant appoints a crusading attorney general named Amos Ackerman, who was actually the first Southern appointee, although he was originally from the North. Ackerman personally takes charge of this campaign against the Klan, brings 3,000 indictments, secures 1,000 convictions, and crushes the Klan. I mean, it was a major, major moment in American history. The Ku Klux Klan that we know of now was the revival of it in the 19-teens and the 1920s, and shared, certain ideology. They wore the hoods, the robes, all that stuff did go back, but it was not the same organization. It was kind of a revival of the concept. And so, as I started reading about this, I said, this is so much more important than the scattered scandals. And the scandals were not scandals where Grant was involved or that he condoned it, and in fact he prosecuted, these scandals vigorously. But that, as a historian, you have to kind of take the larger view. And I felt in the larger scheme of things, did those scandals change anything in American life? No, not really. Did what Grant did for the African American community change things? Yes, and how? Big way.
And for the Indians as well, quite courageous also.
Yeah, the Indians. That's a complicated story because at the time, the Indians on the reservations, there were government-appointed traders. There was an enormous amount of corruption going on. Grant was enormously sympathetic to the Indians, and many more criticisms in his letters of the white settlers than of the Indians. He had, let us have peace. He had, as Frank said earlier, he had a peace policy. And the peace policy, the idea of the peace policy was what he called Christianized and civilized. Terminology would not be used today. And the idea was, he felt that, this is a time when, settlement is expanding westward. The railroads are spreading westward. And as that happens, all these Indian tribes still had a hunting-gathering culture where they would roam across vast distances in pursuit of the buffalo. And Grant just, met with all of these tribal leaders and said, those days are over. You're just going to clash with the railroads and the settlers, and you have to stay on the reservation and become farmers, and learn English, et cetera, et cetera. And he was very, very sympathetic with him. As I said, there was no kind of racist tinge at all to it. Unfortunately for the Indians, they felt that this amounted to a kind of cultural suicide.
Yeah.
That it meant becoming like the white man, which they felt really meant extinguishing their culture. So Grant finds himself, for all of his undoubted good intentions, trapped in a kind of tragic dialectic on this issue.
Yep. Now, I think you rightly put his presidency in perspective. I think it is accurate to say, though, that he occasionally put trust that was misplaced in some key figures, which he ultimately does as well with his own fortune after he leaves the White House.
Yeah, it's mystifying. I mean, Grant, there's a wonderful story when Grant was a boy. There was like this incurable naivete about him his entire life. When he was a boy, I think he was 8 years old at the time, his father wanted to buy a horse from him, from a farmer, so the farmer sent Grant to buy the horse. And he told Grant, the boy, he said, now, you're to offer the farmer $20 for the horse. If he doesn't take it, you're to offer him $22.50. And if he still refuses, offer him $25. So Grant goes up to the farmer, and he said, my father said I'm supposed to offer you $20, but if you don't take that, I'm supposed to offer you 20, you know, to get. And I wish I could tell you that there'd been a learning curve with Grant. You know, I mean, there's this incurable naivete about business, and he's deceived again and again. He said late in life, that was his single biggest disappointment with life, you know, being deceived by friends. And it reaches its height in the White House. There's a man named Orville Babcock who occupied the office right outside Grant's office. We would today call him chief of staff, but that term was not used yet. And Orville Babcock had worked for Grant, you know, in War and Peace for 14 years. Well, there's this, you know, the so-called whiskey ring. There were all of these, all the breweries were taxed. This had started with Lincoln to pay for the Civil War. All the breweries were taxed, and the brewers were paying off all of these revenue agents to avoid the tax. And the one who was kind of tipping the brewers off to the impending government investigation was Orville Babcock. And Orville Babcock was eventually indicted. And there's a heartbreaking letter that Grant writes to Orville Babcock's wife, where he says, don't worry, you know, Orville will be exonerated in this. I've known him for 14 years, and I can't possibly imagine that my faith was misplaced in, you know, this man for 14 years. And it was. And this was someone who was so close to Grant. Grant even gave a deposition that got him acquitted. It was kind of I said Grant was not involved in scandals. This was kind of the one time he crossed the line, because he did protect someone, you know, who was involved in one of the scandals. But then, don't you know, at the last year before he dies, he becomes the victim. These people always saw Grant coming. You know, he becomes the victim of the Bernie Madoff of his day, 29-year-old young man named Ferdinand Ward, who was called the young Napoleon of finance. Grant thought he was a financial wizard, entered into a partnership with him called Grant and Ward. Grant, in his innocence, imagined that he was worth several $1 million, but it was a Ponzi scheme. And Ward kept bringing in new people and paying the old investors with the money brought in from the new people. And so Ulysses S. Grant woke up one morning and discovered that he was not worth several $1 million. Instead, he was worth exactly $80. He'd been completely wiped out. And again, maybe hadn't been warned about Ward, but he'd been through this kind of you know, disillusionment with people so many times in his life, and it is a mystery that it did not make him wary and self-protective.
Yeah.
Very hard to explain.
Well, one last question, and then I want it known ahead of time that I'm going to call on the new member of the Grant Monument Association board over here, our colonel from the Department of History at West Point, and then actually a cadet over there. So get your questions ready. But the upside of Grant losing all of his money near the end of his life was, of course, that was the catalyst for Grant's memoirs.
Yeah. So to that, you know, to that misfortune, we owe the memoirs, because what happened was, two things happened simultaneously. He's wiped out financially, and he's also diagnosed with cancer of the throat and tongue. And he was always a very loyal and loving husband, so he suddenly is petrified that really not if, but when he dies of this cancer, that his wife Julia is going to be left destitute. And Grant noticed after the Civil War that there were all these generals on both sides who had rushed to publish their memoirs and to cash in to make money off it, also to give their version of how wonderful they had been. And he thought there was something very egotistical and self-serving, about doing that. But then suddenly he needs to raise money and raise money quickly. So he agrees to do something that he'd sworn he would not do, that he writes his, Civil War memoirs, and they're to this day considered the greatest military memoirs in the English language, and the writing is it's plain, it's unadorned, but it's very beautiful and eloquent. And there are all sorts of things that I could say about the memoirs, but I'll just kind of pick out one quality that, for me, is central, and it's his humanity, it's his wisdom. My favorite passage is the passage about Appomattox, and what he says, he describes the meeting with Lee, and instead of gloating over the Confederate defeat, Grant has this magnificent passage where he says, "I felt like anything other than rejoicing over the downfall of a foe who had fought so gallantly for a cause, although that cause was, in my opinion, the worst for which, people could have fought for us." So he was kind of, true to his values, but to have that kind of compassion for people whom he did not believe, in the cause that they had fought for. But he respected them as soldiers and as people.
Colonel, please.
I think, sir. So, Ron, you mentioned this weakness that Grant had in trusting others at times. And I wonder sometimes if our strengths and weaknesses don't come from the same place, that he looked for maybe the good, the best in others. But I wonder if you see a connection between that and maybe the story that General Petraeus told us of Shiloh. And we saw that Grant had not a great day the first day. He saw, maybe it's optimism, that he was able to see the best in Sherman. He was maybe even able to look past his own failures of that first day and see the best in himself. So maybe it was optimism.
That's a wonderful question. It's such a wonderful statement. If I were still researching the book, I would have stolen that line from you and used it in the book. Grant made this statement that because he had failed so much before the war, and there were so many people who had doubted him, he made the statement that he said, "I've learned to trust people long after other people have given up on them." And I think that you're absolutely right. That's a wonderful, wonderful insight, the fact that he believed in people enabled Sherman and Sheridan and all of these other, commanders under him to do the greatest work that they had ever done. But that same kind of trusting, believing nature led him astray when that trust was misplaced. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a wonderful observation. The final question from the cadet right there. Please stand up.
Thank you. Sir, you've already talked about the optimism that Grant had, and my question for you would be, how did he mobilize that optimism to galvanize support, not just through the upper echelons of his chain of command, but somehow manage to let it trickle on down to the very bottom and win the war?
Yeah, that's another great question.
Yeah. I said in my talk at Grant's tomb the other day, I said that Grant had this sort of charisma that comes from a total lack of charisma. And just this patient, selfless, tireless dedication to the task. Among the generals whom he succeeded, in Virginia, and his general's chief was George McClellan, or even before him, Winfield Scott, generals, who loved to have medals and plumed hats and would display a certain kind of magnificence and would try to inspire the troops that way, through swagger and ceremony. I think that the way that Grant motivated people was by a very self-effacing, business-like approach in impressing people just with his sheer competence. There also was a very democratic, small d quality to Grant. I'll give you one story, maybe kind of nice story to end on. It's a favorite story of mine. After the fall of Vicksburg, Granted, his beard had gotten longer, and so he went to a barber shop to get a shave. And when he arrived at the barber shop, there was a lieutenant, sitting there getting his hair cut. And of course, all the members of Grant's military family immediately tried to hustle this soldier out of the chair so that General Grant, could get shaved. And Grant said, "Oh, no, you don't understand. This young soldier deserves that haircut every bit as much as I do." And he insisted on waiting until he had gotten his haircut. And I think that was something that communicated itself through the ranks. Grant was never so big that he could not stop and chat with the lowliest private in the Army. And I think that he had the capacity to talk to everyone as peers rather than underlings. Good question. Thank you.
Well, look, I hope that you all now agree with what I announced up front, that Ron Chernow is not just an extraordinary biographer, he is also an extraordinary storyteller. So please join me in thanking Pulitzer Prize winner.
Thank you.